are going to explore, from a biological perspective, the possibility of ending war, and also an area of human biology called sexual dimorphism. We'll examine how both of these relate to creating a human destiny that is more just, environmentally sustainable, and peaceful. We'll consider the why and how of two major changes we could make in the way we live that are necessary in order to achieve that goal. First, we'll need to establish a maintainable global peace system. That means we assemble a critical mass of citizens and visionary leaders who commit to securing a global enforceable peace treaty and a global peace alliance with the qualities needed to maintain it. Second, we'll need to embrace the principle of koinoniarchy, or gender parity governing, from the Greek word koinonia, meaning to share. We'll need full partnership between men and women in governing our lives, not continuation of patriarchy and not establishment of matriarchy, rather a koinoniarchy, where governing is a shared responsibility of both sexes. Consider these enormous challenges, many of them legitimate evils. We'll explore what might result if we made these two changes. All of these issues would be affected in positive ways. For the generations who will inherit the planet from us, we could then realistically envision creating a Star Trek kind of destiny rather than a Mad Max dystopia. The presentation has two roughly 45-minute sections. That length is necessary at minimum to provide sufficient evidence to support the conclusion. You may wish to pause for discussion or reflection between topics covered in several parts in each section, or watch the first section on war in one sitting, parts 1 through 5, and the second section on sexual dimorphism plus the conclusion later, parts 6 through 13. Part 1 presents a broad historical perspective that frames our current existential dilemma, and two assumptions central to the talk's biological perspective. This graph plots estimated numbers of humans on Earth going back 9,000 years. At the far right, roughly 250 years ago, an explosive rise in our numbers begins, attributed mostly to preventing early deaths and increasing food productivity. Imagine what might be the social effects of that explosive rise. Because during hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that shaped our natures, we lived in a world where when resources ran out or disagreements erupted that might lead to what we now call war, some people could pack up their meager belongings and move to an unoccupied place. This relieved the social pressure, and biologists call that very successful adaptation dispersal. As a result, all the places where essential resources of food and water and living space exist, they're all human populated. The graphic at the bottom right indicates that we occupy all habitable land masses. In this Scientific American article, the economist Herman Daly described this by saying that we've transitioned from an empty world to a full world. And he describes how that transition is putting all kinds of pressures on our affairs. We've created a new, changed environment to which we need to adapt. Sweeping tides of refugees and immigrants are impacting nations across the globe. There are no empty places to which unhappy or starving people can disperse without bumping up against people already present, and possibly themselves in dire conditions. I agree with experts convinced that we've actually reached an existential tipping point. Consider these threats to continuation of the global social order, or improbably, but not impossibly, to our extinction. With the single exception of a highly lethal natural pandemic, every one is a potential disaster of our own making. To avoid or survive these evils, we'll need money, will need legions of humans applying ingenuity and sweat? Given the astounding financial, physical, and human capital wasted on wars, avoiding wars would unquestionably be the wise and sane adaptation to make now. So consider that one of Einstein's most insightful quotes is that the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Given human nature, it's impossible to create utopia. But could we change global culture sufficiently to not only avoid some dystopian nightmare, but actually build a better future, a creative, nurturing, positive reality that is peaceful, just, and environmentally sustainable? Recall that the talk's subtitle is A Biological Perspective. From that perspective, the primary assumption here is that to solve these problems and build a better future, not only at a global level but in local communities and homes, we need to understand ourselves. And that means we must look through the lens of biology to answer the question, what kind of animal are we? We named ourselves Homo sapiens, wise man. But much of our behavior is so harmful to ourselves and increasingly to the planet that the word wise may not fit us very well. Perhaps a better choice might have been Homo acutus, clever man, because there can be no doubt that we are very, very clever. During hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived as simple bands of nomadic foragers. But they came to possess behaviors that made us one of Earth's most dominant species. And many of these behaviors weren't based on carefully thought out reason. They were whatever ensured the survival and reproductive success of the individuals who gave rise to us. So, still based on biology, a key second assumption is that rather than our behavior always being guided by reason or wisdom, we need to embrace the reality that much human behavior is in fact guided by genetically based, evolved predispositions, preferences, tendencies, urges, whatever you want to call them, and that they powerfully influence much of our behavior, sometimes in contradiction to what rational or wise thought suggests would be a better thing for us to do. And specifically, we're going to consider why and how some of these urges are not the same for our two sexes. But we begin not with considering sexual differences, but by looking at how ending war relates to creating a better future. War is defined as used here. After that, we consider whether it is a part of human nature, a built-in facet of what kind of animal we are and thus inevitable, or whether it's something from which we can free ourselves. Murder clearly is not war. As used here, revenge killings of specific individuals over personal grievances, things like lethal family feuding, is also not war. We're not going to get rid of murder or revenge killings anytime soon. Both of these go back deeply into our past, perhaps even before we were humans. War is when people band together to indiscriminately kill people in another group, and the majority of the community's non-combatants and religious leaders sanction this action. It is a community's sanctioned killing of people in other groups who have not personally harmed the killers that distinguishes war from other forms of killing. For example, two drug gangs killing each other or even outsiders is not what's being considered, because they're not supported by the larger communities where they live, nor by their religious leaders. Gang killings are policing issues. So having defined war, what we now need to consider is whether war is inescapable, or is it actually a latecomer to human behavior? The work of anthropologists who studied people called hunter-gatherers or nomadic foragers is the place to begin. This is because these societies are our best window into our deep human evolutionary past. They reflect how Homo sapiens likely lived for hundreds of thousands of years, during which we evolved to be what we are today, before we started living in permanent settlements or villages. The anthropologist Douglas Fry did an analysis of the literature on many aspects of hunter-gatherer cultures, 35 of them. If you lump all 35 different kinds of hunter-gatherer societies and analyze them all together, no particular pattern emerges when it comes to war. But Fry separated them into two groups, what he called simple hunter-gatherers and complex hunter-gatherers. When separated this way, interesting patterns do emerge. This table lists 8 social variables down the left column. Things like food storage, mobility, population density, slavery. We can compare these traits between the simple hunter-gatherers in the central column and complex hunter-gatherers to the right. A fundamental resource difference exists between them, having to do with food supply and mobility that I and others believe relates to the emergence of war. Compare primary foods, top left column. Simple hunter-gatherers rely on highly mobile terrestrial game. Complex hunter-gatherers on marine resources or plants, with the result that food storage is rare for simple hunter-gatherers, but it's typical for complex hunter-gatherers. Note the effect on mobility. The complex hunter-gatherers are settled or mostly settled. They have a food resource sufficiently rich and stable that they can put down permanent roots. The classic example of settled hunter-gatherers were tribes along the northwest coast of the United States and Canada that depended on intertidal edibles and massive salmon fish runs. Settling down changed our way of life. It created new environments that elicited or triggered many consequences. For example, look at effects on population size, low population densities versus higher population densities. And there were behavioral changes. Take attitudes about competition, non-acceptance of competition as a desired trait versus the encouragement of competition. Note especially differences in political systems. For simple hunter-gatherers, the political social system is egalitarian, not hierarchical, meaning that men and women have equal social status. If you will, leadership for them is not patriarchal or matriarchal. It is by mutual agreement of all members of the group, men and women. If you will, a koinonigarchy. What's relevant at this point is to look at warfare on the bottom left and note that nomadic, simple hunter-gatherers, who arguably most resemble our deeply ancient ancestors, rarely make war. In fact, and significantly, some of those cultures have never been recorded as making war. This is consistent with emerging theory that our success is due to our impressive capacity for cooperation, the humans as cooperators model, rather than competitively killing each other, the man-the-warrior hypothesis. Also, this is strong evidence that making war is not a genetic predisposition. Otherwise, all of these people, including the simple hunter-gatherers, would commonly make war. Archaeological findings are very clear, however, that once we settled down into villages and then towns, warfare emerged and became increasingly common. Now it may seem universal, but in fact war does not occur everywhere. The red dots indicate centers of distribution of over 80 cultures anthropologists classify as nonviolent and/or non-warring. They're not utopias. They are human beings who have arguments and conflicts, but using physical aggression, even things like pushing and shoving, are rare to never. You may know some of their names, like the Amish, note particularly the Norwegians, Most are totally unfamiliar, like Mardu and Nubians. Sadly, the existence and nature of these many nonviolent cultures is, with a few rare exceptions, not taught in our schools. More commonly, children are left with the impression of history as being built around cycles of war. Here are some other societies that live without war. Non-warring religious groups live within a state-level warring culture, but they create a way of life that avoids war. There are others less familiar all around the world. Again, these are not utopias or perfect humans. The point is that their existence also proves that making war is a very, very bad, arguably evil, cultural phenomenon, but not a genetic inevitability. So the evidence this far indicates that war is fundamentally a result of nurture, not nature. We'll come back to this issue again. Our capacity to make war certainly rests on a number of genetic inherited traits. The ability to stand upright and hold a weapon, the ability to communicate with words, and to unite in cooperative behavior, all depend on genetic inheritance. But as we'll explore further, the actual practice of war is a cultural outgrowth of the societies we create and tolerate, of the ways we raise our children. It is not a genetic inevitability. Here are 7 books, mine among them, that propose we could actually end war. Arguably, it's an idea whose time at last has come. Interestingly, there's much agreement on what to do. Joshua Goldstein is a professor of international relations and an interdisciplinary scholar on war and society. He poses a potential chicken and egg problem when thinking about how to end war. Must we first fix things like poverty, social injustice, human rights, or spread the rule of law, and then peace will follow? Many peace activists are operating under some version of that assumption, as are a lot of lay people. Or do we need to end war first, so we actually have the substantial financial and human resources required to even approach achieving those other desired goals? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? In Winning the War on War, Goldstein makes the case that accepting the legitimacy and values of, and the assumptions supporting war, is the prime cause of many social evils we do not associate with peaceful living. So in Gender and War, he writes, if you want peace, work for peace. If you want justice, work for peace. What are those values and assumptions that support war and oppose peace and justice? Fundamentally, the most pernicious one is that some groups will dominate other groups by force and that this is unavoidable. War, domination by force, is inevitable. Others are that it's somehow normal, or yet worse yet, legitimate. Sometimes even thought to be desirable. Perhaps the elite should rule over the uneducated masses, even if by force. Goldstein's point is that those values and assumptions directly contradict the values and assumptions that would accompany the goals of equality, justice, and peace. So he argues for the global community to tolerate war, or even the notion of a just war, leaves in place a value system that will always, repeatedly, and endlessly counter any efforts to establish and maintain a peaceful and just, better future. For one reason, because no one will believe that creating an enduring, warless, better future is ever going to be possible. So why would they waste time, energy, or money on trying to bring about an impossibility? Now, rather sadly, my research convinced me that this isn't a case of chicken or egg. It's not a case of fix major problems and enduring peace will automatically follow, or end war, then you'll be able to fix things. I concluded that creating that better future requires simultaneous action on many social and technological fronts and must also include ending war. And furthermore, and rather obviously, that ending war will be an enormously complex challenge. War is so deeply embedded in our cultures and our history that I liken an ending war campaign to something as challenging as putting a permanent colony on the moon or Mars. Very complex, very difficult. To achieve that goal, thousands of companies and projects must master technological and social issues. Getting funding out of governments, building the rockets, designing and constructing habitat elements, training astronauts, figuring how to resupply over time, and so on and on. Very, very difficult. But, and this is an important but, I conclude, as has visionaries like Elon Musk, that it is doable if motivated by sufficient resolve. So now let's consider how, if we mustered that same kind of resolve, we could move from wishing to create an enduring peace to actually doing it. From wishing to action. Only a fool or idiot would underplay the difficulty of ending war. Political and social reality dictate that doing so would involve many elements. So many that as I worked on this hugely complex problem, I needed a way to focus my thinking. I began to place actions required to set up an enduring peace, in other words, the end of war, into 9 groups or cornerstones. They're listed here, from embrace the goal to spread liberal democracy. Each ending war cornerstone is like one of those necessary Moon or Mars colonizing challenges, thus my use of that metaphor. Let's explore how that would work. The cornerstones are shown in this logo, which unfortunately has errors, but it's good enough for illustration. They're arranged in a circle clockwise alphabetically. A circle, not a list, because they must be attacked simultaneously. They are complexly intertwined. One affects others. The first and arguably most basic, in yellow at the top, is embrace the goal. You can't end war if you don't embrace that goal and begin working to make it a reality. An end to war isn't going to materialize by happy accident or simply as a byproduct of doing other good things. Although at this time, 2016, many individuals and organizations around the globe are seeking to prevent a war or to halt an ongoing war. Only a rare few are specifically focused on ending all war, and they don't appear to be making much progress. And belief that ending war is achievable is necessary. It's any campaign's starting point. It's the essential foundation underpinning actions of sufficient size, strength, and endurance to reach the goal. For people to have sufficient resolve to even set foot on the path to overcome the challenges of ending war, they have to believe deeply that the goal is achievable. Otherwise, many will give up when the going gets hard. Others will move on to something simpler, something more quickly realized. And most assuredly, the weight of history and the financial profit to be had by the war industry would ensure that the campaign would not only be complex, it would be strongly resisted, particularly by the war industry. And it would get harder the closer the effort was to success. A separate presentation with the title, Ending War is Achievable, 5 Reasons Why, addresses this challenge of belief. It also explains why ending war could, with sufficient resolve, be achieved in 2 generations or possibly less. If you're a skeptic, check out this YouTube video or the blog essay with the same title. A second essential of a successful ending war campaign is in blue to the right of Embrace the Goal, the necessity to empower women. We need to educate girls and women, to engage them in parity governing and peacemaking. It also includes attacking things that seriously hinder them: sex trafficking, abuses of prostitution, the use of rape in war, and so on. Anyone working on the Empowering Women cornerstone, whether they know it or not, is also a laborer in a campaign to create and maintain an enduring peace. Next comes enlist young men. Young men are the single most restless and aggressive members of any society. When they feel alienated, they're dangerous. They're the fodder warmongers use to build armies. We need to make young men part of an ending war effort, and that means meeting their social needs, to feel inclusion in their societies, to have the means to make a living, to have a sense that they are valued. We need to acknowledge them as warriors for and maintainers of the peace. Anyone working on any aspect of how to improve the lot of young men, through education or sports or work training, for example, whether those citizens know it or not, they too are contributing to the ending war revolution. Foster connectedness speaks to any efforts to fight xenophobia, a trait warmongers manipulate to convince people that it's okay to kill someone who is different. These are projects that create a sense of one human family, bound together in a common fate. Community organizers who teach how to work together for the common good. Politicians who stress the power of unity and the importance of inclusion. Teachers and parents who teach values of sharing, not only within their family, but with others. At this point, you should see a clear pattern emerging. We could continue around the circle and find that each cornerstone embraces dozens of issues dealing with some aspect of world affairs, which also happen to be critical to maintaining a war-free future. Ensure essential resources: food, water, shelter, healthcare, education. Promote nonviolent conflict resolution. Show people how to do it. Provide security and order. Without those, no peace can endure. Shift our economies to something equitable and environmentally sustainable. And spread liberal democracy and the respect for human rights that it embodies. The website of futurewithoutwar.org discusses in detail the significance of all 9 cornerstones, and also lists some of the legions of organizations and projects that would benefit from sharing the vision of working together for something greater. Arguably, all cornerstone efforts would achieve the greatest impact on the global zeitgeist if everyone working on one of them could see that what they do daily is part of a larger, profound, historical, ending war revolution. Unfortunately, that magnifying effect of unification eludes us. But now you can again see why I use the metaphor of putting a permanent colony on the moon or Mars. To succeed and be enduring, all of those thousands of efforts will have to be coordinated. To end war permanently, at some points the efforts of each of the ending war cornerstones must also be coordinated. In a paper entitled "To Abolish War," I explain the cornerstones in detail, and suggestions are laid out for how a campaign to end war would function. The closing section, entitled "All Great Projects Require Leaders," makes the case for coordination this way. No great project, certainly no great project worthy of awe, from the building of the pyramids to the erection of the Notre Dame Cathedral or the eradication of smallpox, has ever been accomplished without leadership. Perhaps these coordinators would be hosted by a premier peace institute or a coalition of several institutions, or perhaps, most likely, they would gather around someone's large dining room or student union table, because they will be revolutionaries. At this point, here is the most important takeaway message. The current state of world affairs includes the good news that millions of people of goodwill are already striving mightily in activities needed to create and maintain a global peace. The bad news is that we don't have a global peace to maintain. The cornerstone activities are essential for maintaining peace, but by themselves they clearly do not bring about a global peace. In fact, despite the legions of people working on these efforts, with increasing speed we often seem to be headed for dystopia. So referring back to Einstein, what could we change to get a different and better result? Well, the first change would be to set up an enforceable global peace treaty. 88 years ago, the world's major nations adopted one that was intended to achieve a global peace. You may know about it, although not many people do. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, named after U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand, ultimately had 62 signatories, including the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. Too bad it didn't work. It does remain in effect, never rescinded, but it failed to succeed primarily because it didn't provide for enforcement. Perhaps it was assumed that all nations would, of course, see the worth of avoiding war, and so they would voluntarily abide by the treaty. Instead, the general sad result has been for nations to continue to start and fight wars, although for a variety of reasons they don't declare war. The United States hasn't had a formal declaration of war since 1941 against Germany and Japan, but it has certainly fought a lot of undeclared wars. The League of Nations and United Nations were similar efforts. It's not that we haven't tried. We still have the United Nations, and it does provide a place for countries to hash out world affairs problems, to work on those cornerstone issues. It has a record of bringing peace to one region or another, and of working to enforce peace agreements between groups once they're signed. But the UN also falls short of establishing an enduring world peace because, so far, the world's nations haven't provided it with teeth strong enough to enforce a global peace. For many reasons, the major powers, dominator cultures based in some form of patriarchy, aren't willing to give up their sovereignty to an enforcer, and that includes that they don't want to give up their ability to start a war if it suits them. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and Russia's recent annexation of Crimea are our latest examples. But none of this means we have to give up the vision or the hope of a world based on a philosophy of unity, community, and cooperation instead of war. The Kellogg-Briand Treaty is still in effect. We could update it and give it teeth. We clearly can negotiate complex and enforceable agreements between competing entities when we want to, even if for political reasons we don't call them treaties. The 2015 Iranian nuclear agreement was signed by 32 nations, including the US, UK, European Union, Iran, Russia, and China. The 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, a profoundly positive act of unity and cooperation, was signed by 195 countries. If we negotiated global peace, what might a global community able to remain at peace look like? Do we have no clue? Actually, in 2012, in a paper entitled Life Without War, Douglas Fry laid out some guidelines. Let me say that these do not include the idea of one world government, but rather of global cooperation grounded in self-interest. He presented 6 shared characteristics of 3 different types of cultures from different time periods who consciously created active peace systems. These real, not just hypothetical peace systems, current and historical, illustrate what a maintainable global peace might look like. what an active peace system includes. His most detailed analysis didn't cover it, but the United States is pictured because the 6 shared traits also apply to the peace system that is the United States of America. These are the 6 characteristics. The blog and a YouTube presentation entitled Ending War is Achievable 5 Reasons Why also explain them in some detail. First of all, the alliances he analyzed found ways to create an overarching sense of shared identity, ways to expand the us. They also develop and maintain social and economic interdependence among subgroups. They establish intergroup social ties through things like marriages or shared celebrations. They actually create special symbolism and ceremonies intended to reinforce the peace they've made. They establish, teach, and reinforce the kinds of values that maintain peace. And finally, they create superordinate institutions for conflict management, essentially some kinds of judicial or negotiating bodies for settling disputes. Again, for details, check out Fry's paper or the YouTube video. People hammering out a global peace treaty and setting up a peace system intended to endure the stresses of time would wisely incorporate all of these basics. Fry's work is especially important by pointing out that active peace systems are not theoretical. They're not utopian fantasy. They do in the use of war to resolve conflicts. They have existed and do exist when people have the will to set them up and maintain them. Now, the historian and peace activist Kent Shifford, in his book, From War to Peace, describes the progress the global community has actually already made toward a global peace. His YouTube video entitled The Evolution of a Global Peace System is a succinct 17-minute summary of 26 peace-ending trends, from establishment of supranational parliamentary systems, to a decline in the prestige of war, to the spread of democratic systems, to a rise in planetary loyalty. It sets our current global status into realistic, positive, and hopeful perspective. We are not starting this campaign from ground zero. Now, most people realize that to shape a better future requires us to take political reality into account, not just wishful fantasies about human social behavior. We've just covered a lot of political reality about the difficulties and requirements for ending war. But shaping a better future also requires that we be guided by biological reality. Failure to take some very relevant aspects of biological reality into consideration is arguably the most seriously underappreciated or completely ignored factor affecting attempts to end war or to rid ourselves from the social evils listed earlier. So now we take a deep dive into a biological phenomenon called sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism explains the existence of some evolved, highly significant male-female differences in our social preferences. We'll look at how those sexual differences relate to creating a better future, including one that is without war. The term sexual dimorphism comes from the Greek dimorphos, meaning having two forms. This reality shapes much of life on Earth. Most species of plants and animals have males which make sperm, which are tiny and motile, and females which make eggs, which are comparably huge and non-motile and contain nutrients sufficient to develop into a new individual. Humans obviously fit this pattern. There are other reproductive possibilities. Some species reproduce asexually, like this tiny water creature called a hydra, that is sprouting a new hydra out of one side, and single-celled forms like the amoeba, which is pulling itself apart. Some, like mushrooms, use spores. But the vast majority of animals and plants, at least sometime in their life cycle, reproduce sexually. Now, sperm have the equipment and energy for movement, but are small. And eggs, which hold sufficient nutrients for development of a new individual, are relatively very large. This huge difference between sperm and eggs in size, composition, and function has profound biological ramifications because eggs, having all that nutrient material, are much more expensive to make than sperm. Males can make thousands or even millions of sperm, but in every species, females produce far, far fewer eggs. This fundamental size asymmetry sets up a situation in which reproductive pressures on and strategies pursued by males and females are very different. Anyone who closely observes animals sees these differences played out in many forms of competitive male-female behavior. Observers often refer to some male-female interactions as a battle of the sexes. Sexual dimorphism can occur in three domains: anatomy, physiology, and behavior. It exists in external anatomy, as you see in these male-female pairs, things like color, size, fundamental body shape. It also exists in internal structures like skeletons. If you watch TV shows like Bones or CSI, experts often look at skeletal or dental remains to tell whether a human victim was male or female. Sexual dimorphism in physiology isn't easy to illustrate because it's about things like chemical reactions. Most familiar to you are differences in blood levels of the sex hormones testosterone and estrogen. Another fascinating example is that levels of the hormone oxytocin, often called the love or cuddle hormone because it's important to forming social bonds, they're consistently higher in women. But it's sexual dimorphism in behavior that's critical to discussing human social affairs. It seems obvious that males and females of sexually reproducing species aren't going to behave identically with regard to reproduction. But differences in proclivities that aren't directly related to reproduction also occur. For example, during breeding season, red-winged blackbird males stake out a territory and defend it from other males. In contrast, females scout territories, settle onto one that seems to have good food and hiding places, and proceed to build a nest. After mating with the territory male, they lay eggs, incubate them, and rear the young. An elephant herd consists of females and their offspring, including young males. But when a male comes of age, the females expel him, allowing contact only during breeding season. Expelling males is a built-in proclivity or preference that regulates elephant social affairs. Male and female lions can live together, but it's the females that have the proclivity to unite to kill prey to feed the whole pride. The main urges of a pride male are to guard the pride from other males and mate with females as often as possible when they're in heat. For gorilla families, food consists of vegetation, and the females' biological urges motivate them to spend their days eating and caring for their young. They also biologically prefer to let the male determine the direction of the group's movements. When he moves, they follow. If danger threatens, he's the one with the proclivity to protect the group. So now that we know what it is and what to look for, we can consider how behavioral sexual dimorphism plays out for us in ways that relate to this talk's subject, creating a better future, a more peaceful and just human destiny. This is an artist's reconstruction of a male and female of one of our ancestors. You'll note right away the significant size dimorphism, which also characterizes Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis. Size dimorphism is much reduced for modern humans, and by the way, This is thought by some to be related to the emergence of monogamy. What we'll explore first is why our sexes have significantly different behavioral proclivities when it comes to using physical aggression for any reason, including resolving social conflicts. This book describes in detail the biological reason for why that's so. At this point, we're going to run rapidly through a succinct summary. Recall first that we're mammals, because our females supply milk to our offspring from mammary glands, and we're primates, closely related to other great apes. A number of reproductive traits that are true for other mammals and primates are also true for us. So here are 3 basic biological realities that affect women's proclivities with respect to social conflicts and especially physical aggression. Reality number 1, the biological bottom line for all living things is to reproduce and have offspring that have offspring. If you don't reproduce, your genes and the traits they govern are eliminated from the game of life. For example, I didn't have children, so genes influencing my social preferences won't be passed on. From a biological perspective, successful reproduction is what life is all about. Reality number 2. For female mammals, especially female primates, reproducing is a very expensive investment, beginning with production of eggs as opposed to sperm, and then additionally investment in time, risks taken, and energy expenditure. What does that mean? Well, female primates carry their offspring to term, nourishing it from within their bodies, often for months. Then they risk the serious hazards of childbirth. Then for a substantial period of time, they provide milk from their body for nourishment. They must protect this offspring, care for it, and in our case, support it for years before it's old enough to reproduce. The earliest at ages roughly between 8 and 13. If you have children, you can likely relate to that monumental reproductive effort. And then after their offspring reproduce, research shows that women in most cultures are still deeply involved in making sure that the offspring of their offspring also survive and thrive. They invest in their grandchildren. This is unquestionably, for female primates, including us, a very extended, risky, and expensive process that puts enormous reproductive pressures on females, most especially so for us, since our offspring are born so very helpless. As a consequence of all this, reality number 3 is that the ideal social situation for female primates, including us, is social stability for long periods. Anything that threatens the life of these expensive offspring or their caregiver. For humans, certainly something like war has been and is hugely counterproductive for women. Many traits characteristic of how women respond to conflicts are a reflection of their evolved, strong preference for social stability. For example, women in general are more naturally inclined towards negotiation, mediation, and compromise. Why? Because solutions arrived at by those nonviolent means often result in win-win outcomes which tend to be more socially stable and longer lasting. Note, however, that women will urge the men to wage preemptive war if the women can be convinced that they, their children, or their community are under some kind of imminent mortal threat. For the overwhelming majority of women, fighting, even in defense of community, is a last resort. But as fierce defenders of children and community, and that includes their way of life, women will fight if necessary. In fact, military men who have fought with women tell me that if drawn into fighting, women can be vicious fighters. Women are not by nature pacifists or saints. What they are by nature is determined preservationists of socially stable and nurturing communities. Let me repeat that. Women are not by nature pacifists or saints. This is not what is being asserted. What they are by nature is determined preservationists of socially stable and nurturing communities, an innate preference that influences a wide range of women's social choices. A review in this book, going back several hundred years, shows that strong women leaders have waged wars of defense or preservation. Think of Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, or Elizabeth I of England. But historically, women leaders in power have been overwhelmingly less inclined than male leaders to launch a war of conquest. Elizabeth I of England is an example of the former protective sort, as evidenced by her mounting a navy that defeated the Spanish Armada. And if the history of the period is to be believed, Cleopatra of Egypt is an example of the less common woman leader, having a genuine lust for conquest. So now, believe it or not, we've just covered, in a very fast summary, how natural selection for reproductive success shaped the essential relationship of women to using physical violence, to waging war, and to a preference for living in and creating socially stable community. Now we turn to two further biological realities. These apply to men and to their relationship to war. Reality number 4, for male mammals, including male primates, the biological reproductive game is very different because males never invest in offspring as heavily as females do. In some primates, fathers invest nothing but sperm. Human fathers often become involved in some support and protection of their young, think monogamy. But this isn't even the case in all our cultures, and with only rare exceptions would a man's investment approach the mother's investment. And very importantly, if a man loses an offspring for any reason, from a fight within the community where he lives, or in the course of a war, men have the potential to father replacement offspring relatively easily compared to a woman. They simply need to find a woman to impregnate, and they may or may not take responsibility for the years-long care required to bring that child to sexual maturity. As a consequence of those realities, for many male primates, including men, maintaining social stability is not as high a priority as it is for females. Yes, it is important to men who have no desire to live in chaos, but not nearly as important as it is to women. Actually, the urge to rise in dominant status is, in many species, a primary male driver, because higher dominance has generally, historically, been correlated with greater male reproductive success. Much of men's social lives is focused on rearranging the social order to achieve greater dominance, and sometimes this involves using physical violence. Cultural anthropologist Christopher Bohm wrote Hierarchy in the Forest: The Evolution of Egalitarian Behavior. In it, he describes life within egalitarian tribes in Africa. What's relevant here is how hard these egalitarian, nonviolent people work to make sure that what they call upstart males, or females, but mostly males, cannot assert themselves in a way to increase their dominance. At a minimum, they're ridiculed. Say a hunter brags about what a big gazelle he brought down. A woman may immediately chuckle and say how nice for him, since what he brings in is usually so puny. If ridicule doesn't suffice to nip urges to dominate in the bud, upstarts can be sanctioned by group shunning for a while, or even the extreme of group ostracism. If he won't quit his efforts to rise in dominance over others, they toss him out. We, men and women, have inherited from primate ancestors the urge to form dominance hierarchies. This urge for domination, the desire to control others rather than share or compromise as partners, when that desire becomes an overarching passion in a human heart, it becomes a poisoned wellspring of the evil that humans do to each other. It's the killer of lives and societies and a generator of war. For a community to remain stable, tendencies for increasing one's domination that might result in physical violence, especially killing, those tendencies have to be nipped in the bud one way or the other, using customs, education, laws, and even punishment. Now, some other traits, more characteristically male than female, can be used to build an army. One is aggressive male bonding. Certainly, this proclivity has always facilitated protecting a group from predation. It's also key to many forms of hunting. We see the tendency expressed in the male love of aggressive team sports, in young boys that get together to do pranks, like draping neighborhood yards with toilet paper, and when angry men form a mob, say after a stolen election or simply after a soccer match. These mobs are very unlikely to be composed mostly of women. A warmonger counts on this tendency when he wants to make war and needs to unite men into a force that can kill. A third and very admirable trait, more typical of men, can also facilitate building an army. This is willingness to protect the group, even at the risk of death. A clever manipulator will assert that our group, especially women and children, must be protected from some evil other group. For reproductive reasons just described, women are much more reluctant to risk death. But when it's convincingly asserted that the group must be protected, most men find it emotionally impossible to let other men go do the risk-taking, fighting, and dying while they stand by with the women. Arguably, this can be explained in part by an emotional reluctance to lose social status in the eyes of other men or the women. This summary of human behavioral sexual dimorphism with respect to social conflict versus social stability, the use of physical aggression, and the embrace of war has been very compressed and very simplified. But hopefully it's clear why, for reasons associated with reproductive success, the majority of women in all cultures have a much stronger preference for maintaining social stability than do the majority of men in those cultures. With respect to many social choices we make, these sexually dimorphic differences are a defining aspect of what kind of animal we are. To understand how male-female differences influence social interactions of many kinds that would be involved in building a better future, not just ending war, we need to dig still deeper into biology because humans have many hundreds of behavioral traits, and so far research indicates that many, if not most, traits of the sexes overlap. But some overlap more than others. And what's relevant to social affairs is when differences between the sexes would make a group of men choose differently from a group of women, and a mixed sex group choose differently from only men or only women. These graphs roughly illustrate how overlap works. Imagine that we measure three different traits, A, B, and C. The range of possibilities for a given trait is plotted on the horizontal axis. Like, say, the degree of empathy for other people, ranging from virtually none to acutely empathetic, or a personality type ranging from extremely shy to outrageously extrovert. The numbers of persons having a given trait is plotted on the vertical axis in a group having equal numbers of men and women. In each graph, one curve represents the measurements of all women and the other represents measurements of all men. When trait A is measured, we see an almost perfect overlap between the numbers of men and women, with most people measuring somewhere in the middle range. This means that in a given context, with respect to trait A, the majority of both sexes would respond or behave similarly. When trait B is measured, we see that although there is some behavioral overlap in the middle of the range, the majority of men and women behave or choose differently. Male and female peak numbers of individuals are not the same. And when trait C is measured, we again see some overlap, but the range of variation isn't the same for men and women, the men's range being much broader. The women would in general be much more in agreement with each other than would the men in general. And note that the vast majority of women would not agree with the majority of men. If we could measure all human traits and plot them like this, which in reality we can't, but if we could, there would be many, many different graphs for different traits and different graphs in different cultures. The point here is that when considering how sexual dimorphism affects social behavior of groups, the study of human affairs at group level, we're not concerned with individuals. We're asking whether statistically significant differences between the sexes will cause groups to behave differently. And research and common experience shows that men are more likely to use physical aggression that results in killing. Perhaps the starkest comparison in any culture would be the kinds and rates of physical aggression in a male prison versus kinds and rates in a female prison. Now, you are likely thinking, what about learning? Isn't learning what teaches us how to behave? Here are two extremely different socialization contexts. What behavior is likely to be learned and expressed by boys and girls raised in a Quaker community compared to the likely behavior learned and expressed by boys and girls raised in the Islamic Caliphate of ISIS? At one time, it was actually thought that nurture always trumps nature. But much research has put that idea to rest, at least for biologists. The most powerful studies searching out the relative influences of nature and nurture have been done using fraternal and identical twins. This study is just one recently published meta-analysis of 50 years of twin studies on over 17,000 traits. An important takeaway message is that not even one trait is just genetic or just environmental. The tendencies to avoid physical violence or improve one's dominant status using physical violence, or an abiding concern for children and community. These traits are going to have both environmental and genetic components, learned and inherited influences. But comparative studies make clear that whatever the learning environment, Quaker or ISIS, the genetic predisposition and observable adult behavior of the two sexes are not identical for traits involving using physical violence or concern for children and a socially stable community. To illustrate how male-female differences play out when a gender-balanced group is making a socially critical decision, here is a simple example using the case of war. Imagine a legislative body with parity governing. There are equal numbers of men and women. They've been debating whether to go to war now or let negotiations in Geneva play out a bit longer. The thumbs up and thumbs down illustrate symbolically the percentages of men's vote. Note the hypothetical but not uncharacteristic percentages, with 70% of men in favor of declaring war now, but 30% favoring more negotiation. So it's not that all men would favor war now. Compare that to a corresponding hypothetical women's vote. 20% for war now, but 80% favoring extending negotiations. It's not that all women would vote against charging into war, just that a greater percentage would. So in this gender-balanced group, we have 9 votes for war now and 11 for negotiating some more. This illustrates how giving women a voice in decision-making can add a restraining influence on some characteristically male inclinations. It is absolutely critical to note, however, that you would not get this restraining effect on male inclinations if only a token number of women were in this deciding body, say only 20 or 30% of the total votes. The effect depends on something approaching parity governing. Lesser measures will not prove effective. In a paper published in 1999 for the World Bank, the authors had noted that numerous behavioral studies had found that women were more trustworthy and public-spirited than men. Women are more likely to exhibit what's called helping behavior. They take stronger stances on ethical behavior. They behave more generously when faced with economic issues. This suggested to the authors that women would be less likely to sacrifice the common good for personal material gain. To look deeper, they compared rates of government corruption to the percent representation of women in Parliament in more than 100 countries, and found that the greater the representation of women, the lower the levels of corruption. So in many contexts, like how to spend a community's money, let's say on building a community library versus refurbishing the already present ballpark. Having only one sex, in this example only the men, making all our public choices all the time might not always lead to the very best result for communities over the long term. And recorded history, in texts like this one, indicates that in the world's dominant cultures, major social decisions involving governance have overwhelmingly been shaped by men for at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. From historical records, we know exactly what the world would look like when men govern pretty much without any meaningful female input. We have done great things, created technological masterpieces, works of stunning beauty, mind-boggling advances in science, and much, much more. We are indeed clever, and I believe a species worth saving, and for which we should build the very best, most excellently nurturing future we can. But we also know that unrestrained male inclinations have given us repeated cycles of war and destruction. There is no reason to believe, if we continue to operate under the same reality of male-dominated leadership, that these endlessly repeated cycles of war and devastation would cease. Arguably, we may finally engage in one with weapons of mass destruction that may prove to be existentially fatal. But here is a basis for hope. Most men abhor war, that is, actually killing other people. They can love playing at war and war games, even joining together to plan war. We do like to cooperate, but not actually killing other people. Men must be trained and conditioned to kill other people. That natural revulsion is a noteworthy part of what kind of animal we are. Even what we call alpha males, like these men, John Fitzgerald Kennedy or Nelson Mandela. Alpha males don't love war. Men I call hyper-alpha males, though, are different. The Genghis Khans and Napoleons. They are out-of-control men, meaning that they are unconstrained by their culture or their women. They're emotionally driven to dominate all others, whether in a small tribal world or a world that spans continents. And they're distinguished by being willing to kill to do it. They are the generators of war, the initiators of war, the warmongers. They kill or have others kill for them. They don't wear a label that says warmonger, but they assemble an army and/or trigger it to strike the first blow. We have contemporary versions of these hyper-alpha men on all sides of our current conflicts. To repeat, war is fundamentally the result of unconstrained human male biology run amok. But my best guess is that the percentage of hyper-alpha males in our populations, the actual warmongers, is maybe 10%. Warmongers are a tiny tail that has been wagging the dog of civilization for way too long. The global community needs to learn to identify our contemporary warmongers and refuse to elevate them to positions of power or, when necessary, remove them before they light the fires to ignite a massive, global, and possibly existentially fatal war. So what might we achieve if we shifted to male-female partnership in governing at all levels of our lives, to koinoniarchy? As it turns out, we actually have some real-world examples of what women's influence might do and has done to move us to a better future. Let's begin with poverty. The Heifer Foundation gives income-producing livestock, like a cow or a hive of honeybees, to people in poverty. When the animals produce offspring, the recipient must pass this gift to a neighbor. Heifer Foundation was among the first to confess openly that they got the best results when they gave to a woman. She was more likely to use the gift in a way that benefited her family and also her community. Muhammad Yunus, winner of the Nobel Economics Prize for giving microloans to poor people, also discovered that women were more likely to spend the money successfully in creating a business. Too often men tended to spend on things that immediately increased their social status, like frequently paying for all the drinks at the local coffee house or buying a flashy car. Women in general were also better at repaying the loans. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Wu Dunn, in their wonderful book Half the Sky, tell stories from across the world that unequivocally make the case that if a woman is given education or financial means, it regularly leads not only to pulling her family out of poverty, her efforts spread to the benefit of her community. Here's another reality with wide social affairs applicability: the powerful effect of educating girls. Boys often leave their community, frequently to find work. And if there's war, they're commonly pressed into military service and may die never to return. Girls are much more likely to stay, and they go home from school and educate their mothers. The mothers grow reluctant for their sons to be dragooned into being soldiers. They begin to see other positive prospects for both their girl and boy children. The educated women begin to lift the entire community. The education of girls has charmingly been called the girl effect. Google it and you'll find numerous groups that have embraced this revolutionary idea. Starting in the late 1900s, books began highlighting the positive effects of women as leaders in government, business, and communities. These are just a few. Academic and popular articles on women's positive effects on a wide range of human affairs are too numerous to even begin citing. These are examples of cross-cultural research that compare different kinds of societies on things like giving public goods, governmental corruption, peace building, and internal and external rates of violence in a society. Anderson and colleagues compared social giving in matriarchal versus patriarchal cultures in India and found somewhat surprisingly that men contributed more to public goods in the matriarchal societies than in patriarchal ones, perhaps because they can anticipate or trust that their contribution will be put to good use. Already mentioned, Dollar and his colleagues, looking at more than 100 countries, found a positive correlation between women's empowerment and lower levels of corruption. The last 4 works examined the levels of female empowerment, judged by things like levels of women's education and numbers of women in leading positions in government and business. They all document positive effects when women's voices are influential. A 2014 quote from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who knows human societies and who was addressing economic growth, business performance, peace agreements, and social issue legislation, sums it all up. Equality for women means progress for all. Now, before leaving sexual dimorphism, a comment must be made about individual behavior because of the danger of sexual stereotyping and because we need to think about what kind of visionary leadership is needed to shape a positive human destiny. Sexual behavioral dimorphism that affects the behavior displayed by groups is a reality for some traits. It's the reason why so many cultures recognize a yin and yang, a sun and moon, vive la différence. But individual human beings need to be judged and treated individually because the reality for individuals is uniqueness. The slide lists traits in the United States commonly thought of as female and male. Reality is that every person is a unique, complex combination of what their society considers to be male and female traits. In everyday terms, in differing degrees, we all have a female and a male side. Now, some of us are way more in touch with our female side. Say a person, boy or girl, who is very emotional, non-assertive, sensitive, a bit too self-critical, but also sweetly nurturing and empathetic. And some of us are way more in touch with our male side. Someone, boy or girl, who is aggressive, competitive, very self-confident, self-oriented, non-self-critical, and in fact, rebellious and risk-taking. And some of us display a mixture of traits that can be described as being in touch more equally with both male and female sides. This could be a man who is not only aggressive, self-confident, competitive, and bold, but also self-reflective and empathetic. A woman who is not only nurturing and empathetic, but also independent, competitive, and bold. Essentially, all societies have available to them, if they choose to take advantage of it, a rich variety of individuals, a massive diversity that can either be embraced or forced into rigid stereotypes. So if we want to start a powerful social revolution headed in the direction of a positive destiny, what kind of leaders should we follow? Who should we elect? What traits characterize good leaders? A leader cannot be shy. He or she must be in touch with aspects of their male side like being assertive, independent, and bold. But wisdom demands that they are also able to be self-critical and reflective, able to change their mind when needed. And to lead well rather than be a bully or tyrant, they need to be in touch with traits from their female side, like being accepting and empathetic with regard to the people they lead. Our very worst choice for a leader would be someone having traits guaranteed to foster continuation of the world's dominator, warring, patriarchal cultures. Someone aggressive, bold, competitive, non-self-critical, strongly self-oriented, and woefully lacking in being accepting or empathetic. Our very worst choice for leaders. After writing a book that focused on gender differences, I concluded that parity governing, koinoniarchy, would be a necessary condition underlying any enduring peace. My worry then and now was whether we'll make the transition to sufficient female empowerment fast enough to counter those ominous existential trends listed earlier. Or will the unrelenting social urge for domination, so very characteristic of male behavior and pretty much unconstrained in patriarchies, will that aspect of our nature win the existential struggle for human destiny? This is what is now in contention. As it turns out, serious efforts to colonize Mars, a dangerous world of inadequate gravity, no oxygen, and killing cosmic radiation, they are already underway. So let's return now to the two changes referred to at the beginning, changes we could make if we want to achieve the much less difficult objective of ending the use of war on Earth. First, we can embrace the principle of gender parity governing. A world where women are second-class citizens or worse is a world where unrestrained male biology is currently spinning completely out of sane control and is armed with savagely lethal weapons. The female half of our species brings to our societies two powerful urges. Women characteristically are motivated by a stronger preference than men for avoiding societal violence and by an enduring concern for nurturing communities and children's welfare. Women are a massive reservoir of unused positive leadership in directions we want to go. Second, it also lies within our power to assemble a critical mass of citizens and visionary, powerful leaders who commit to securing a global, enforceable peace treaty and a global peace system having the qualities needed to maintain it. For the global community to continue to accept war is to abandon us to a future of perpetual war. A global peace treaty would provide the emotional and intellectual space and the financial resources to pursue all of the projects embraced by the cornerstones of any enduring peace. If we don't change what we're doing, history indicates that we should expect to continue to create dominator, warring societies and the traits that characterize them. Logic suggests that to get a radically different result requires that we do something radically different. Empowering women on a massive scale would certainly qualify as doing something radically different. So would creating a global peace system. The goal of this talk has been to explore what if. What would the future be like if the global community made these two changes? So rather than a tidy conclusion, we end up with three big questions. Can we change? Meaning, do we have the biological capacity to embrace shared governing by women and men and to construct a global peace system? Will we change? Meaning, can we muster the determination to change? One positive thing we know for certain is that although we don't always behave wisely, we know we are supremely adaptable. Starting from those tiny nomadic bands in Africa, we crossed towering mountains and vast oceans, and with relatively humble tools we've occupied all the continents. Our intellect is a marvel of the universe, allowing us to split atoms and discover thousands of other worlds. Nearly every challenge we face in our journey to occupy Earth is a matter of vision and will. Someone had a vision of something better, something new, and was able to motivate enough of us to act. John F. Kennedy had the vision that within 10 years we should send men to the moon and return them safely to the Earth. And he was able to instill the will to do it into the hearts and minds of the thousands of people needed to achieve what was to most people a preposterous-sounding goal. As a human behaviorist, I know we absolutely have the capacity to create laws and customs and educational systems to ensure that women govern as equal partners with men. It's a matter of vision and will. We absolutely can write a peace treaty with sufficient teeth to enforce it, and a global peace system that embraces the beliefs and values needed to maintain it. It's a matter of vision and will. So the final question is, what kind of adaptation will we make to the new social and ecological world we've created? It's our destiny, our choice. For anyone wishing it, here are a few words about my relevant background. I'm an evolutionary biologist with a PhD from UCLA. My areas of specialization are in animal behavior, including human behavior, communication, conflict resolution, and gender differences. For my PhD, I studied communication and conflict behavior of gulls, like the breeding pair of western gulls pictured in the center. I did so at the locations on the slide: the Farallon Islands off San Francisco, on Bird Rock off Catalina Island, California, in the bird flight cage of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and on islands in the Gulf of California, primarily Guardian Angel Island. These were some of the most delightful years of my life. I gained insight into conflict-resolving behavior by studying how breeding pairs used communication to resolve conflicts. The fancy name for the study of animal behavior is ethology. Since I've been studying war and peace, I am now officially a peace ethologist. And as an undergraduate major in cultural anthropology, I studied non-patriarchal and nonviolent cultures. The perspective I have presented here is that of an evolutionary biologist with a strong background in cultural anthropology. Much of my work on war is in this book. Early chapters describe conditions that resulted in the emergence of war. Understanding when and why we began this form of killing speaks directly to the question of what kind of animal we are and whether or not we could hope to end war. These ideas have been painted in very broad strokes. I invite you to a futurewithoutwar.org website. You'll find essays on the cornerstones, a free book download, links to organizations, and much more. My most recent book on ending war is Shift, The Beginning of War, The Ending of War. It's a Kindle download or at Amazon.com. For an explanation of why we can end war, check out the essay or slideshow entitled Ending War is Achievable: 5 Reasons Why.